Some time ago, I recorded a reading of the abstract for the article The Marxian Theory of Social Change by A.K. Saran, as I couldn't locate a complete copy of said article. I did ask if any of my subscribers would be able to send me a complete copy, and one did, so thank you very much, Jean. I'm not sure if you want me to use your full name, so I won't. So with many thanks to Jean, I will now provide you with a reading of the entire article, minus the abstract, since I've already done that. I should say this is a very challenging and long article, but it's an exceptional critique of Marxism, so it's well worth struggling with. So with no further ado, let's begin. The Marxian theory of social change is part of what is called dialectical materialism. Also, it consists, in a large part, of an analysis of the dynamics of capitalism, the laws of motion of capitalist society. Anything like an adequate exposition and examination of these is not attempted here, for together they make up almost the entire Marxian system. And in a short essay, I cannot offer a systematic critique of Marxism as a whole. Methodologically, this may not seem quite sound, especially because the various aspects of the Marxian system presuppose the validity of dialectical materialism. However, the critical notes on the dialectical approach to social change, Section 2, may be found sufficiently general and fundamental to show the logical weakness of the Marxian version of dialectics. Regarding the second omission, it can be pointed out that Marx's detailed analysis of the dynamics of capitalist society is an application of his general theory of social change. It is therefore possible that this analysis may be mistaken at points without his general theory of social change being thereby invalidated. On the other hand, if Marx's general theory of social change is untenable, his theory of capitalism can be valid in parts only. It would not then support the general conclusions to which it is supposed to lead. It is not easy to specify in a consistent and rigorous manner the meaning of the concept of social change as used in the system of Marx. It would be helpful, however, to make the following distinctions which, it is hoped, will illuminate Marx's use of this concept and show certain confusions which he could not avoid. As distinguished from change in a specific sphere like technology, politics, law, morals, etc., social change refers to changes in the whole social system. I don't say social change refers to changes in social relationship, since the political, the economic, the legal, etc. all fall under the category of social relationship. Social being defined principally and not in terms of relationships falling under it. The question of defining social cannot be discussed here. But this does not quite settle the meaning of this concept, for it may be used to mean changes occurring in the social system, when these are changes through which the social system maintains itself, though these should properly belong in the theory of social homeostasis, which forms part of the theory of social order. Or it may be used to mean changes in the system when these disintegrate the system, and do or do not bring about the replacement of the given social system by another. This suggests a fourth meaning, namely, change or replacement of one social system by another. The third and the fourth senses may be combined in a single theory, and then the concept of social change would signify the processes or procedures by which one social system disintegrates and thereby gives rise to another and higher system. This is regarded by Marx as the characteristic mode of social change, and hence, from his point of view, the theory of social change is the theory of social development, which should be distinguished from the usual theory of social evolution by its emphasis on the idea of growth through disintegration, class struggle. It is shown in the course of this essay, however, that Marx does not consistently adhere to the latter meaning of this concept in all its implications, and that this gives rise to serious confusions. This is partly due to the fact that Marx does not has not cared to give a precise explication of the concept of social change. Few sociologists do, but it is also partly due to inherent defects of the particular theory of development he seeks to expound. Section 1. I shall begin with a summary of the Marxian theory of social change as given by Marx himself in the preface to his A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. The division into numbered paragraphs is borrowed from Buber's Karl Marx's interpretation of history. 1. And these are all quotes. In the social production which men carry on, they enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. These relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material powers of production. 2. The sum total of these relations of production constitute the economic structures of society, the real foundation on which rise legal and political superstructures, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. 3. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life. 4. It is not the consciousness of man that determines their existence, but, on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. Sorry, that should have been men, not man. 5. At a certain stage of their development, the material forces of production in society come in conflict with the existing relations of production, or, what is but a legal expression of the same thing, with the property relations within which they had been at work before. 6. From forms of development of the forces of production, these relations turn into their fetters. 7. Then comes the period of social revolution. 8. With the change of economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. 9. In considering such transformations, the distinction shall always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. 10. Just as our opinion of the individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so can we not judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must rather be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social forces of production and the relations of production. 11. No social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. 12. Therefore, mankind always takes up only such problems as it can solve, since, looking at the matter more closely, we will always find that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions necessary for its solution already exist, or at least in the process of formation. 13. In broad outlines, we can designate the Asiatic, the ancient, the feudal, and the modern bourgeois methods of production as so many epochs in the progress of the economic formation of society. 14. The bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, but of one arising from the conditions surrounding the life of individuals in society. At the same time, the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create the material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. This social formation constitutes, therefore, the closing chapter of the prehistoric stage of human society. And that is it for the quotes from Marx. The most widely accepted view about Marx's theory is that, according to it, the economic factor is the most fundamental, if not the only, factor of social change, I do not wish to challenge this view of this way of characterizing the Marxian theory, but I do wish to emphasize that it is important to be clear about the meaning of the predominance of the economic factor in terms of Marx's whole thought. In the first place, therefore, we should note that Marx does not distinguish in the usual way between the social and the economic system. It may be thought at first sight that according to him the economic activities of men bring about a social system, but Marx has definitely rejected such a view. It is true that there is no dearth of passages wherein Marx or Engels talk as if the social were caused or determined by the economic, but in order to understand it rightly, we should look deeper. The theoretical system of Marx is monistic, that is to say, the world in his system is finally explained in terms of only one postulate or principle or reality instead of two or more. This postulate is called by Marx the self-evolution of matter. Everything else is the product of this evolution and represents a definite stage of this evolutionary process. Both the economic and the social life of man are aspects of this evolution. What Marx means is that in order to understand a set of social relations at a given time, we must find out how they have come about, and this would show them to be the expression of production relations. But it could be equally correctly said that the production relations are an expression of social relations, provided, 1, it is understood that the social relations are a stage in the self-evolution of matter, and 2, the socio-economic system in question is still developing. That is, the relations of production still represent the form of development and have not become its fetters. The difficulty does not arise at this point, but at a more fundamental level, for, to the question, which relations are prior, the social or the economic, the correct Marxian answer would be neither, or both, if you think in terms of absolute priority. For both of them are aspects of an historical process. This historical process is the self-evolution of matter, and hence it is not economics that is ultimate, but matter. And it is at this point that we may get a fundamental inconsistency in Marx, of which the often found emphasis on economics or technology is merely a reflection. The idea of self-evolution of matter consists of two concepts, that of evolution and that of matter. So either there are two forces, or matter is only a convenient name for sheer dynamism. The latter, I suppose, is the Marxian position. But pure dynamism, consistently carried through, would culminate not in monism, but in zeroism, which indeed is the position of certain schools of Buddhism which start from a strictly dynamic conception of reality. Marx holds an endogenous theory of social change. He holds that the fundamental cause of change is the internal weakness of every social system. External causes can only help and coincide with the process of disintegration. Summary 11. This, however, is a simple deduction from monism. This is put forward in the form of the theory of dialectical development, according to which every stage of affairs, in the very course of its development, reaches a stage which is the exact opposite of the initial state. The conflict thus brought about between the old and the new is resolved by the maturity of the new, which is the old form at a higher level. Applied to human history, it works roughly in the following way. As a result of long processes of evolution, there are at a given time the human and the natural orders. The natural order, as it is not adapted to human needs. It has to be constantly modified by man's effort. This effort is called production. It will thus appear that needs are the bridge between the human order and the natural order, and are the occasioning factor in the constant modification of nature by man. With this formulation, Marx does not disagree, but he does not regard it as finally satisfactory. We will come to this point later. The modification of the natural order by man for the satisfaction of his wants gives rise simultaneously to technology on the one hand, and certain social relations among men on the other. With the emergence of the technological order, we can no longer speak in an empirical sense of two separate orders, the human and the natural, for the technological order represents the form of the constant interaction between the two orders. However, as a convenient heuristic device, we may continue to speak in terms of the two orders. To every change in the natural order, technology, production, should correspond an appropriate change in the human order, that is, in the system of social relations, the exchange and distribution organizations, etc. This is the fundamental condition of social equilibrium, a gradual maturing disturbance in this equilibrium, indicating an increasing difference and disproportion in the modes and rates of change in the two orders, is the condition of social change and of the establishment of another equilibrium at a different and a higher level. At this point, certain terms should be explicated. Marx formulates his theory of social change in terms of mode of production, forces of production, relations of production, means of production, and conditions of production. Clear and rigorous definitions of these terms, however, are not given by Marx, and hence we do not find unanimity among his interpreters on the explication of these key terms. This should be kept in mind while reading the exposition that follows. Means of production denotes machines, tools, other instruments of production, raw materials, knowledge of the use of techniques of production. It excludes the laborer who is the agent of production. Conditions of production refers to the given historical setup. In the case of a change in the production system, it will refer to the total state of affairs in which the particular innovation occurs and to which it has to be adapted. Forces of production. Of this, there are two divergent interpretations. Typical of one school are the following explanations. The first by Cornforth and the second by Sombart. 1. According to Cornforth, the forces of production consist of A, the instruments of production, and B, the people with their production experience and skill who use these instruments. This interpretation is confused and partly overlaps with the concept of means of production, which, according to Cornforth, consists of instruments of production plus land, raw materials, etc. Moreover, when read with Cornforth's explication of the concept of relations of production, such an interpretation involves the recognition of a direct relation between men and means of production, in addition to the system of relations among men on the basis of division of labor. This, in my opinion, is not correct, since Marx does not admit a direct relation between man and instruments of production. This follows from his exclusion of use value as such from the sphere of political economy on the grounds that it does not directly express a social relation, that is, one among men. Property relations and production relations are relations among men, i.e., social relations. They are not abstract juridical relations between men and things. Referring to the summary quoted above, Sombart says, quote, If these sentences are to have in general any meaning, it can only be this. Given a definite basis of technical development, for what production forces can be if not technical potentialities is hard to comprehend. This technique determines the formation of economic life. This formation determines all other culture. End quote. In fairness to these interpreters, it must be pointed out that there is in the text of Marx ample support for them. In the passage to which Sombart refers, Marx does speak of productive forces as material forces, and in another passage in a contribution to the critique of political economy, page 309, he clearly indicates the production forces are the dynamic aspect of means of production. The acceptance of a Sombartian interpretation involves accepting the technological theory of change against which there are a number of passages in Marx and Engels. What is even more important, it will, on a close and consistent view, go against some of the fundamental theses of Marxism. In my opinion, it is not a question of explaining and reconciling, but of selecting and rejecting. I think it may be better to give importance to those passages in Marx which support the following interpretation of this concept, though neither this nor any other interpretation would be free from difficulty if consistently adhered to. By forces of production, then, is meant the mode of production itself in its dynamic functional aspect. That is to say, while the mode of production refers to the production system from a structural point of view, the concept of productive forces refers to the dynamism of the same system in operation. This brings us to the key concept, the concept of mode of production. Mode of production. As just remarked, this should be interpreted as a structural concept referring to the way in which the human realm is related to the natural realm. It will include means of production, relations of production, and conditions of production as elements. It does not, we may repeat, include the productive forces which represent not an element, but the power of the whole. The relations of production must therefore be constantly modified so that the full power of the whole may be operative. These, however, have a tendency, for which there are certain important reasons, to resist change and thus generate contradictions in society. But this tendency is never ultimately effective. The production relations are, in fact, constantly undermined, until they are replaced by a new set appropriate to the working of emergent productive forces. Since it is the change in the mode of production which ultimately brings about the change of the whole socio-economic system, it is important to understand what precisely is meant by change in the mode of production and how this change comes about. First, however, we should note that in the light of our discussion, the conflict between the forces of production and production relations is the conflict between the logic of the whole and the logic of the part. And obviously, in such a case, the part must accommodate itself to the whole. On a technological interpretation of the concepts of mode of production and forces of production, there is no logical ground for requiring that the one be adjusted to the other. There cannot be any reason why one part should be subordinated to the demands of another part. According to the interpretation here adopted, the mode of production will be said to change when the manner in which human society is related to the natural order becomes different. This, however, is less simple than it sounds, and I must say that Marx's formulation on this all-important point is neither systematic nor consistent. At first sight, it appears that by change in mode of production, nothing more than a change in the technique of production is meant, and by social change is meant change in production relation. Certain passages in the summary, 5 and 14, support this impression. Analytically, however, this is unsatisfactory. The mere introduction of new techniques of production cannot be taken as the replacement of one mode of production by another, and the feudal economic order did not change by yielding place to the capitalistic order as soon as the first use of steam power was made. It survived until the feudal production relations also changed and were replaced by capitalistic production relations. And this means that technology and production relations are both included in the mode of production, and a change in the mode of production is a change in the relation between the two. And hence it will not be quite correct to speak of changes in mode of production as the determinant of socio-economic change if the former means changes in technology alone. Nor can we say that the two changes take place simultaneously, or that the first is only the other side of the second, and hence the one will include the other. For it is fundamental to the Marxian theory that there can be and always is a gap between change in technology and changes in production relations, so that it is the task of social revolution to bring the latter into harmony with the former. The question then is, what does Marx mean by change in the mode of production? In trying to find a consistent answer to this seemingly simple question, I've come upon unsuspected difficulties which throw doubt upon the validity of the structural interpretation of the concept of mode of production. As the problems involved are, in my opinion, complicated and concern the logical foundations of Marxism, I have thought it necessary to devote a whole section to their formulation and discussion. Section 2. I shall first formulate some general problems in the theory of structure or system, I shall use them interchangeably, for the emphasis on what may be called a social system approach to the problems is a fundamental feature of Marx's thought and a point of contact with an influential section of modern sociological thought. I shall then discuss problems specifically connected with the meaning of mode of production as used in the Marxian theory of social change. First, then, the general problems. To speak of structure or system in the way I have done above is to imply that elements may remain the same while the structure may be different, and conversely, that the elements may be different while the structure may remain the same. I do not think this implication of the concept of structure can be avoided by some suitable modification in the definition of this concept. The idea of social system is ultimately to be derived from the idea of logical form. Here, as a matter of fact, Russell, Wittgenstein, and other logicians think primarily in terms of identity of structure or form in two aggregates whose elements are different. This, however, raises several difficulties. The first, and perhaps the most troublesome, is the difficulty of avoiding the reification of this concept while recognizing the independence of a structure from its constituent elements. The same danger is implicit in another aspect of this concept. When we speak of the concept of structure, we do not simply refer to the fact of interrelatedness of various elements. More essentially, we speak of the way or mode of this interrelation. It seems that this would give rise to no difficulty once we realize that structure is a higher level concept than that of the interrelation of elements. It still, however, remains a problem to give an explication of higher level in a manner that would not involve some subtle form of reification. The psychological interpretation of logical constants is no solution to this difficulty. The second difficulty concerns the idea of elements and sameness. It is well known that no formally irrefutable proof for logical simples has yet been devised. What most of the arguments do prove is merely that if we drop the idea of simples, we should be involved in an infinite regress. This cannot be accepted as proof unless it can also be shown that an infinite regress always, or in this particular case, ought to be rejected. Of course, one of the serious inconveniences of this view is to make finitude itself a huge problem. Insofar as this bears on the concept of structure, it is difficult to choose between the postulates of finitude or infinity, for the basic difficulty of discovering interstructural relators or the problem of establishing the continuity of a set of structures remains whichever postulate is adopted. Connected with this are the difficulties arising from the fact that elements form part of structure, and this, as Wittgenstein brilliantly shows, leads to a dissolving relativization of the concept of simple elements. And then again, the idea of sameness is one of the great difficulties, for it is well known how difficult it is to formulate criteria of sameness. The concept of covariation, which is implied by the idea of system when viewed in time, gives rise to another closely connected problem, viz., that of formulating precise criteria for distinguishing between changes in the system and changes of the system, i.e., its replacement by another. For covariation implies that every initial change in the system would, in course of time, bring about a new state of the entire system. Obviously, it is not easy then to tell a wholly different state of the same system from another system. These problems, it seems to me, are aspects of a fundamental problem in the theory of structure, which may be formulated somewhat as follows. In the last analysis, the concept of structure is, as I said above, a logical category. Our present notions of this idea, however, are not wholly free from features which spatialize or temporalize the idea itself. For example, we cannot precisely distinguish logical order from spatial or temporal order, though I think we do assume that logical order is neither temporal nor spatial, even though we need not say that it is an eternal order. We recognize this when, in the logic of relations, we admit, say, non-symmetrical relations which are neither symmetrical nor asymmetrical. In consequence, we have no sufficient general theory of structure. Secondly, at the present conceived, the concept of structure implies a modal ontology, that is, an ontology in terms of modes of possible being. The idea of modal ontology, though not formally self-contradictory, since being and existence are distinct notions, is yet an extremely elusive one. The difficulty, however, is not this elusiveness. A modal ontology would ultimately dissolve the very notion of elements, which, however, is necessary to the concept of structure. On the other hand, it does not seem possible to frame it in terms of substantial ontology, for it is doubtful if we could have a concept of structure such that the elements have only one possibility of combination, namely, the actual one. For such a concept would not be that of structure, but of a complex with distinguishable parts. Its constituents would not be separable elements. It may be objected that we could think of a structure whose elements could be combined only in the former way after disintegration, but this does not really meet the requirements, for while preserving the uniqueness of combination possibility in point of kind, it nevertheless gives us a multiplicity of possibilities in point of time. And whether or not we speak of the same combination, even though temporally it is not the same, depends on how we explicate the concept of same, the difficulty of which we have already pointed out. In view of what I said earlier about our concept of structure not being purely logical, it is necessary to add here that in order to think of this possibility on the logical plane, we would have to imagine an uninterrupted sign system in which only one combination was valid, because only one act of formation and transformation rules was possible with those signs. Here it may also be mentioned in parenthesis that Wittgenstein's distinction in the Tractatus between the concepts of form and structure can be regarded as an unsuccessful attempt to bridge the gap between modal and substantial ontology, both of which seem to be involved in the idea of structure. Another set of difficulties is connected with the precise relation between the concepts of structure or system and hierarchy. But it is not necessary to elaborate these problems generally, for this is enough for our purpose, which was to provide the necessary critical framework for a deeper understanding and fair assessment of Marxist sociology. But before I pass on to the difficulties which the attempt to interpret the concept of mode of production in structural terms encounters within the Marxian system, I should perhaps answer an obvious objection. If, it may be asked, the very concept of structure is beset with such serious difficulties, would it not be better to dispense with it altogether in the interpretation of Marx, who often prefers to talk in historical terms? Briefly stated, my answer is as follows. A sociological approach, in contradistinction to one that is individualistic and psychologistic, requires some such concept as that of system or structure. Insofar as the attempt to explore the logic or meaning of this concept encounters serious difficulties, the sociological approach necessarily shares them. It is a realization of this which, it seems to me, leads Hayek to advocate a modified form of the individualistic approach, which he calls the compositive method. It falls outside the scope of this essay to show the failure of the Hayekian solution, or to suggest lines along which the solution to the problems formulated above may be sought. Suffice it here to say that Marx defined definitely rejects the individualistic approach in favor of the sociological. The category of socio-economic system is one on which he lays great emphasis, and that he would have been the last person to favor the compositive method. I now turn to the main problem, that of explicating the key concept, mode of production, in the Marxian system. As already pointed out, one finds an astonishing multivalence and looseness in Marx's use of this and the related concepts. But two disparate uses of the term are particularly important in connection with our interpretation. Sometimes it stands for the socio-economic system, as when he speaks of the capitalistic or feudal mode of production, or, as is clearly implied in including exchange and distribution in it and under it, see the chapter on commodities and capital and note 45 to the present essay. Sometimes it stands simply for technology, as when Marx says, quote, "the hand mill gives you the feudal lord," end quote, and at others it seems he means by mode of production the technological setup taken conjointly with the production relations, as is said in summary 5. Of these, the second may be left out of consideration, since it does not occur in careful formulations of Marx. In the same way, the concept of production relations is never formally defined, and what is worse, it is used in 3 different senses, which Professor H.B. Acton has skillfully disentangled. First, the production relationships refer to those relationships which are involved in the very operation of the instruments of production, for example, steering a ship while someone else looks after the sails. Secondly, they refer to those wider relationships that grow up in order to allow production to go on without interruption, for example, land. For example, the relation between agriculturalists and a political staff to allocate land, and thirdly, to relationships that are necessary for the distribution of what has been produced. The relationship between growers, transporters, and consumers, and so on. Now, though there is justification for calling any one of these relationships a production relationship, it is unjustified either to shift between them or to lump them all together, particularly when a scientific examination of the socio-economic system is being made. Unfortunately, however, Marx makes no attempt to analyze the concept production relations, and in actual argument confuses all 3. In the summary quoted above, he uses the words sum total. Quote, "The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society," end quote. But this may be an error in translation. This, as was emphasized earlier, makes more than one interpretation of these concepts plausible. In what follows, my aim is not to defend the interpretation here adopted against objections and difficulties. The looseness and confusion in Marx's own formulations do not allow that. What I shall try to do is to show that the shifts and overlappings among various meanings of these key concepts are aspects of a fundamental theoretical confusion which can be eliminated only at the cost of Marxism itself. This analysis will show how the Marxian theory of social change derives a good deal of its plausibility from these very confusions. The fundamental confusion is what I may call the confusion of conceptual orientations. A number of orientations are found intermingled in Marxian formulations without any critical awareness of their differences. First, there is the systemic and interdependence frame of reference. Then there is the causal orientation. Thirdly, there is the historico-genetic orientation, where the different ideas of layer and level are jumbled together. Fourthly, there is the correspondence and reflection framework, where again the two concepts are not distinguished. It is true that given such an inclusive framework, there are few things that cannot be proved or disproved. But this should not lead us to believe that Marxism is a huge trick. For how could such an incredible conceptual farrago survive? Not only that, it still flourishes. To understand this, we should note that all these confusions have their logical root in the belief that hierarchical i.e. systemic views of the universe, have to be replaced by a view which is systematic but entails no idea of hieros. The Marxian worldview is one among many such attempts. The rejection of the traditional view animates practically all modern thought. How such a belief could arise and gain an almost hypnotic hold on the minds of most of us is hard to tell. Let us see how the confusions mentioned above operate in Marx's thought. One of the pictures that dominates Marx's thinking on critical structure and change is that of emanation, a concept which represents a temporalization of the hierarchical view and hence can easily degenerate into a confusion of the systemic and genetic views, such as we find in Marx. He thinks first of the emergence of man from nature, and then there is the basic primitive interaction between man and nature. Out of this latter comes a set of relations, the economic, out of which in turn emanates another set, the political, legal, etc., and these would appear to form a vertical system. Now, the immediate problem on this view is to be clear about the successive sets of relations, or between substructures and superstructures as they are called by Marx, when he is using a different non-temporal architectural picture, which last terminology, by the way, involves more explicitly the problem of explaining the constitution of each substructure. Now, it would seem that the problem is solved by understanding the interrelation of these successively emanating sets of relations as historico-genetic or simply as historical. On closer examination, this will appear to be unsatisfactory. The historical is an order of succession, whereas the social is an order of coexistence. The genealogical analogy, which is sometimes clear in Marx's mind, would not be apt either, for there the layers are literally superimposed one upon another, indicating that they never coexisted, but succeeded one another in that order. All that the picture of layers or stages can mean is that a given order of coexistence has come about gradually over a period of time. This is, of course, obvious, but it by no means follows that the various stages should coexist in a particular arrangement. A gradual process is not eo ipso a graded order. An order of succession can neither determine nor explain an order of coexistence merely by the fact that some of its moments or durations are contemporaneous. The time spans of the generations represented by father and son coincide for a period of time, but this alone cannot explain the relations between the two generations, either as they coexist or as one succeeds the other. To believe that it can is to ignore the distinction between physical and cultural time, just as to explain social order and control essentially in terms of overlap and interlocking is to confuse the social with the mechanical order. In fact, the plausibility of Marx's historico-structural view of society depends upon a tacit confusion of the concepts of genesis, causation, and systemic connection. The logical weakness of combining the historical and the structural points of view in the Marxian manner will be apparent if we consider that the historical first, even if it could be discovered, cannot be the center or foundation of a socio-economic system, for that would be tantamount to viewing history as the temporalizing of the eternal. From the historical viewpoint, the foundation of a given historical order can only be the synthesis of the entire history up to that time. Marx is aware of this, for in A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, he says that in order to speak of any mode of production, one must speak of the whole historical process. The economic interpretation he thinks to be justified on the ground that the general laws of this historical synthesis can be, and in fact have been, discovered. But here one can see a serious fallacy in Marx's claim that the laws of history can be derived from a study of history itself, and that therein lies their claim to scientific validity. When the economic or the man-nature relation is said to have always been the basis of the whole socio-cultural order, the meaning of the word basis is that without which not. The presupposition would thus mean if there had been no economic or technological relationships in the first instance, all other relationships would not have come about. There would have been no human history. Now, this is not an ordinary generalization. It is peculiar in having the form of a counterfactual conditional. It is doubtful whether universal counterfactual conditionals of the form "if all minds were destroyed, there would be no colors and no sounds" are at all meaningful, but I do not presuppose to raise this question here. My argument here is the following. For the validity of every counterfactual conditional, a true generalization about factual connections is necessary. What would be the validating generalization in this case? As far as I can see, it can only be whenever there were no economic or technological relationships, there were no other relationships. But this itself is a contrary to fact statement, and one that history can neither confirm nor disconfirm, for history is the record and interpretation of what has happened and is happening, of that which did not happen, or of that which would have happened. There can be no history. This argument, it is necessary to point out, does not involve the question of the logical foundations of the usual method of scientific inference. There may or may not be the logical warrant for the statement, because all or a large number of green mangoes have been sour in the past, all green mangoes will be sour in the future, and for assuming that since all of the green mangoes eaten have been sour in the past, all green mangoes would have been sour in the past. What the above argument does show is that there is no warrant for any inference of the form because all green mangoes have been sour, green mangoes could not have been non-sour. And it is an inference of this form that Marx uses in his theorem about the basis of human history. The main point is that the question about the basis of, or the ultimate decisive factor in human history, is a metaphysical question, and that therefore any answer to it, materialist or idealist, cannot be established by empirico-historical or natural scientific methods. It by no means follows that metaphysical solutions are inadmissible. On the contrary, it could be shown that scientific theories of history, whether Marxian or otherwise, do not succeed in discarding altogether the question of the meaning of human history in one form or another. Then this would indirectly show the necessity of the metaphysical view of history, assuming, of course, that one does not give up the postulate that history is intelligible and considers the aesthetic view undesirable even insofar as it is possible. That Marx could not solve the problem of defining the relations between different orders of society when these are viewed as successive stages of the self-evolution of matter is clear from the fact that he used a number of concepts to explain this relation, each of which has different implications, and raises serious problems of its own. Besides saying that the different orders in society are related as substructure and superstructure, the difficulty of which I have been so far examining, Marx says that the different orders correspond to each other. Also, that the higher orders, superstructures, reflect the lower, the foundation. It is sometimes neglected that correspondence and reflection are two different ideas. To say that two orders correspond to each other is to imply their independent reality. If A corresponds to B, neither A nor B may be a copy of the other. When, however, A is said to reflect B, the reality of B is independent of A, while that of A is not independent of B. If the correspondence idea is taken seriously, the superstructure terminology will have to be given up, and one would have to meet the problem of showing the continuity of the different orders which are said to correspond. If we adopt the reflection idea, And it seems to fit in better with the spirit of Marxian thought. The following questions will arise. First, what is the necessity of the reflections? This question arises because a reflection, even if it may not always be an illusion, is necessarily a full or partial duplication, and hence a superfluity unless there be sufficient reason for it. To this, Marx's answer may perhaps be found in the following, quote, "The religious reflex of the real world can, in any case, only then finally vanish, when the practical relations of everyday life offer to man none but perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations with regard to his fellow men and to nature. The life process of society, which is based on the process of material production, does not strip off its mystical veil until it is treated as production by freely associated men and is consciously regulated by them in accordance with a settled plan." End quote. It is unclear whether this is meant to apply to the religious superstructure alone or to all superstructures generally. Support for the view that it is meant to apply generally can be found in the second sentence of the passage quoted above, as also in the Marxian view of the society to come, in which things would assume a perfectly intelligible and reasonable aspect. In this ideal society, it is well known, the state would wither away, property relations of which laws are reflections would be abolished, marriage would be founded only upon true love, and men would not be specialists but would be able to pass from one specialized skill to another with perfect ease. It should be noted that the condition Marx stipulates for the disappearance of the religious superstructure implies man's knowledge of the world as a limited whole, in which he himself is included both as creature and creator. Such a condition being incomprehensible, the reflection theory of religion should be considered a failure. But even if we grant that the religious reflex of the real world arises from a misunderstanding which, being unnecessary in a rational society, would disappear in course of time, the specific necessity of other reflections, the nature of misunderstanding responsible for them, remains to be explained. The theory, apart from its untenability, is thus inadequate to the problem of superstructures. If, now, the reflection theory of religion is generalized, we finally get a view of society in which the successive sets of relationships beyond the economic technique disappear, a result which scarcely makes sense. I therefore conclude that Marx's explanation of the necessity of the religious reflection cannot be generalized. In that case, some more questions are in order. Wherever there is any permanent possibility of reflection, as in the physical world, there is some medium, such as light, which has an independent objective reality. In Marxism, this medium is, perhaps, consciousness. Consciousness, according to Marx, is merely the highest product of matter. The notion of product is left vague by Marx. Lenin interprets it to mean that consciousness is only the reflection of being, at best an approximately true, adequate, perfectly exact reflection of it. If we accept this interpretation, we cannot regard consciousness as the medium through which we get various reflections of matter. But if we interpret it to mean that consciousness is a stage in the self-evolution of matter, which seems to me the correct interpretation, we would be no better off, for Marxism emphasizes the role of non-veridical reflections which are said to be due to false consciousness. Matter, however, cannot produce false consciousness unless at some time consciousness becomes independent, which positions is repudiated by Marx. Quote, "It is impossible to separate thought from matter that thinks." End quote. This would show how important the notion of reflection is in the Marxian system. The Marxian epistemology can hardly be stated without it. It is another matter to say that Marx has left this notion entirely unclarified. If somebody thinks that I have taken an analogical notion too seriously, I should ask him to try to state the relation involved without the analogy of reflection. I doubt if he would succeed. It should be further pointed out that Marx cannot believe in the traditional doctrine of analogy, which assumes the ineffable. In any case, it is necessary to examine the adequacy of an analogy, and the above scrutiny shows that Marx's is inadequate. Not only does Marx thus fail to explain the interrelations of what he calls the base and the superstructure, the dialectical principle in emphasizing interconnection of things itself confuses several distinct notions. Quote, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics does not regard nature as an accidental agglomeration of things, of phenomena unconnected with, isolated from, and independent of each other, but as a connected and integral whole, in which things, phenomena, are organically connected with, dependent on, and determined by each other. End quote. It is remarkable how the notion of genesis, organically connected, interdependence, and systemic control all belong to different orders, are here thrown together. One may seek to justify this on the ground that there is no real confusion here, since the notions are meant to apply to two different orders, nature and society. But this would not do, since Marx and Engels insist that there is a single set of laws for nature, history, and thought, and hence, if one set of phenomena are governed by organic connection, another by systemic connection, there would be a third connection ensuring the continuity of all interconnections. It seems therefore that the above passage refers to only one type of interconnectedness and not to two or three different ones. Given the implicit equivocations and conceptual confusions that have been laid bare above, it is easy to see how Marx can use mode of production sometimes to refer to what, according to him, is the economic technic base of the social system, and at others to the whole, socio-economic system itself. If the superstructures are regarded as reflections on the base, then we can easily see that in reality the entire social system is equal to its base and can stand for it according to a justifiable figure of speech. Again, the equivalence can easily be seen when a different picture is used and the social system is viewed as a house of many stories. All the stories literally stand on the foundation. If we now view this picture sub specia temporis, we can see the equivalence of the mansion with its foundations, for the whole mansion automatically falls with the demolition of the foundation. I have shown that these analogies do not stand scrutiny and that the theory cannot be stated in logical terms. But once the reader is persuaded of the urgency of destroying the existing social order, these pictures begin to dominate his mind, and he does not notice that even as pictures they fail, in important respects, to illuminate problems of social dynamics. For though a house falls automatically with the destruction of its base, given the base, it does not rise automatically upon it. Nor in terms of this architectural picture is it possible that the base may slowly decay and be replaced by another, while the old superstructure may continue for some time along with the new emergent base. The confusion of pictures, however, helps the ordinary reader to overlook the inadequacy of any one picture, for before one discovers the inaptness of one, there is a clever shift to another, this time a biological one. Quote, new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. End quote, my italics. This biological picture may illuminate how the superstructure grows on a given base, but then in these terms it will not be possible to establish the equivalence of the base and the superstructure either from the dynamic or from the static standpoint, for among the human species the female does not die after giving birth to the child. Thus, our analysis shows how a confusion of different images serves to cover up fundamental logical difficulties in Marx's theory. It does not, therefore, seem possible to offer an interpretation of the key concept, mode of production, which will be consistent with other tenets of Marxism, even if interpretation and consistency are not conceived in narrow textual terms. Neither the narrow sense of mode of production, that is, the equilibrium of technology and production relations, nor the broadest sense, that is, the socioeconomic structure, would alone be adequate. In view of this, the best that can be done is to recognize both these uses of this concept in Marx and conceive their relationship in the following way. Technology and production relations, modes of production in the narrower sense, form the nuclear relation in the whole system of socio-economic relationships, mode of production in the broader sense. But it was necessary to state this simple-looking point only after a great deal of patient analysis and an excursus on the concept of structure, because otherwise it could not have been shown that A, the precise meaning of nuclear, central, pivotal, basic relation in a system is not discussed by Marx, hence the relation between the entire system and its nucleus is left obscure. That B, this is connected with unsolved problems in the general theory of structure, and that C, Marx does not succeed in showing how or why production relations and technology must be the nucleus of the entire socioeconomic structure, and that D, difficulties are obscured from view and a deceptive demonstration of the theory is given by Marx by means of conceptual confusions and shifts between diverse images. Now, one may ask at this stage, why should it be necessary to adopt this equivocal use of a key concept? The simple answer would be, because there seems to be no escape from it unless one chooses to adopt only the narrower interpretation, which leads to a strict technological theory of society and history, conflicting with certain other fundamental emphases in Marx. Another point in favor of the interpretation here proposed is that it helps us to see the confusions on which the appeal of the mode of production theory of social change rests. Marx's overall view is structural sociological. This, as we have shown, is heavily overlaid with a historico-genetic view. This unacknowledged use of two different terminologies gives an air of obviousness to the theory. The system terminology helps Marx to present the mode of production as the pivot of social change, while the historico-genetic terminology helps him to avoid showing why it is the pivot. This raises another important question. If we regard the relation between technology and the immediately necessary group relations as the center of the whole socioeconomic system, do we not thereby accept the technological interpretation of Marxism? The answer is as follows. If the historico-genetic point of view is retained, Marx's use of the term mode of production as equivalent to the whole socio-economic system does not save him from the technological theory of history. In order to see this, we should consider a well-known passage from Engels. Quote, "According to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its results, to wit, constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, etc., juridical forms, and then even the reflexes of all these actual struggles in the brains of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views, and their further development into systems of dogmas also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggles and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. There is an interaction of all these elements in which, amid all this endless host of accidents, that is, of things and events, whose inner connection is so remote and so impossible of proof that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary." End quote. Here one can see the divergent directions in which the structural and historical causal points of view pull. The structural point of view is represented by the emphasis on interaction and multifactorial analysis. The influence of the historical causal standpoint, however, is persistent, for the ultimacy and prior necessity of the economic factor is equally emphasized. Given the framework of Marxian philosophy, the ultimacy of the economic leads to a technological theory of history. If, however, we drop the historical causal point of view in this case altogether and stick to the structural point of view, the difficulty is easily resolved, for then one can make technology central without committing oneself to the technological theory. For the center of the system does not singly determine the system, neither ultimately nor at any other time. By the principle of covariation, all elements determine each other. The system does not have any independent variable. I should repeat at once that this by no means solves or eliminates the problem of establishing the center of the system. Assuming, however, that it is solved, there is clearly a sense in which we can say that the system determines itself. Having explained and defended our interpretation of the concept of mode of production in Marx, we may now turn to consider the meaning of change in the mode of production. The first thing to note is that when mode of production refers to the entire socioeconomic system, the proposition, the whole society changes if the mode of production is changed, becomes a disguised tautology. Hence, one cannot ask why or how changes in the mode of production determine changes in the entire socioeconomic system. Nonetheless, it is a question that is not only meaningful, but also of fundamental importance in the Marxian system. It can be asked from the historico-causal point of view, but in that case, as has already been shown, the Marxian answer becomes untenable. The other framework which allows this question, though in modified form, is the one provided by our interpretation, according to which the socio-economic system is conceived as the systemic set of production relations, conditions of production, instruments of production, etc., with production relations and instruments of production conjointly forming the center of the whole system. The question now will be, how does a change at the center work on the system as a whole? Marx's general answer, under the assumption already made, would be unassailable. A change in the central relation will, in course of time, change the whole system. This, of course, is part of the meaning of the concept of structure or system. But this general answer does not dispose of all the problems that are relevant here, and it is of the greatest importance for a proper appraisal of Marx's thought to be clear about them. In the first place, this approach requires us to distinguish between two meanings of change, a distinction to which reference was made at the beginning of this essay. The first type comprises changes that maintain a system in a given state, the problem of homeostasis, and under the second type come those which disequilibrate the system and finally destroy it. It should be pointed out that the replacement of one system by another on a higher, lower, or coordinate plane is not implied by the concept of system and, if postulated, has to be explained independently. Now, both these meanings of change are implicit in the Marxian position insofar as it is held that any given system develops for a certain length of time, after which it begins to change in the direction of disintegration. And yet, strictly speaking, a dynamic and dialectical system such as that of Marx cannot admit any concept of social homeostasis, and hence, in the last analysis, the usual distinction between social equilibrium and disequilibrium is inadmissible in the Marxian system. In the view of Marx's emphasis on the direction of change, this is particularly unsatisfactory. Many other difficulties arise from the fact that the Marxian system implies and requires the above distinction, but does not formally admit it. Some of these difficulties a perusal of this essay would indicate, but the more acute ones arise in the Marxian theory of human action, of which ethical theory forms a part, which falls outside the scope of this essay. Another important distinction in the theory of social change is that between change in the social system and change of the social system, and this too cannot arise for Marx, for all changes in the social system are ultimately also of the system, since it is through these changes that history moves from a lower to a higher social system. A twofold difficulty arises from this. In the first place, the telescoping of the two types of change is unwarranted from the structural point of view. And secondly, the notion of higher and lower social systems brings in qualitative categories incompatible with the scientific, positivistic orientation of Marxism. To meet these difficulties, Engels invokes the law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa. For our purposes, says Engels, we can express this by saying that in nature, in a manner exactly fixed for each individual case, qualitative changes can only occur by the quantitative addition or quantitative subtraction of matter or motion, so-called energy. I'd just like to interject that, it's astounding that people didn't see the glaring error in this at the time it was written. Anyway, continuing. This quote-unquote law is supposed to be based on a discovery made by Hegel. Says Marx, quote, "Here, as in natural science, is shown the correctness of the law discovered by Hegel in his logic, that merely quantitative differences beyond a certain point pass into qualitative changes." End quote. Incidentally, the formulation of the law contained in this passage differs from that by Engels quoted above, but we shall remark on this later. This law has been examined by a number of critics who have exposed its weakness from various points of view. Recently, Professor Acton has subjected it to a most patient and searching critique. I will not, therefore, attempt a systematic examination of the law. I shall, however, make a few points which have been comparatively neglected by others, but which seem to me important. In the first place, we should note that the way in which Engels formulates this law is not adequate to its obvious meaning and purpose. From Marx's reference to it, quoted above, and also from Engels' own discussion, it is clear that according to this law, all qualitative changes can be explained solely in terms of quantitative changes. This would require that quantitative changes should be both the necessary and sufficient condition of qualitative changes. Engels, however, writes as if it were enough to show that quantitative changes are always necessary for the occurrence of qualitative changes. Secondly, we have to note that according to Engels's enunciations, the converse of the law is also true. That is, quantitative changes can occur only by qualitative changes. Though Marx and Engels did not pay any attention to the reverse operation of this law, its consideration will reveal serious logical difficulties. It is clear that in this form the law states an equivalence between quantity and quality, such that the transformation of quantity into quality and that of quality into quantity would represent tautological transformations, and hence one of the two could always be eliminated in theory. To use modern terminology, we can say that the law of transformation of quantity into quality and of quality into quantity shows that quantity and quality are two alternative and perfectly equivalent terminologies for describing or explaining change. I do apologize for the background noise. In other words, the law has no causal or genetic significance. It is obvious, however, that Marx and Engels did not at all understand the law in this way. When they speak of quantity being transformed into quality, they are thinking in causal or genetic terms. They emphasize that something new comes into being. This is quite clear from Marx's reference to this law. Quote, merely quantitative differences beyond a certain point pass into qualitative changes, end quote, my italics. I've tried to vocalize the italics. I'm hoping that comes across. It is true that the equivalence of quality and quantity implied when the law is said to hold in reverse can also be interpreted in terms of correspondence between the two on two different levels of reality. I do not think anybody would seriously propose this interpretation. It is not supported by the exposition that Engels gives of the law, and apart from this, it has metaphysical implications which would be inconsistent with the positivistic materialism of Marx. It may be remarked that in the formulation and demonstration of this law, three different notions are involved: those of emergence, reduction, and equivalence. As usual, they have been mixed up, and the fact altogether overlooked that while the first two notions imply an asymmetrical relation, the last is a symmetrical relation. This is partly obscured by the fact that while the law is formulated in terms of two highly general concepts, its exposition or demonstration is almost always on an empirical plane in terms of illustrations drawn from various types of natural and social phenomena. It is characteristic of this method that the notions of quantitative and qualitative change are never independently defined. It is not possible, therefore, to scrutinize the illustrations with precision. It may, however, be safely assumed that by purely quantitative changes would be meant repetition of the same operation. For instance, a change in the volume of something brought about by adding to it more units of the same thing. Now, if the law under discussion is to be applicable to human society, the above notion of quantitative change should be applicable to human actions and historical events. I think it can be shown that it is not. The realm of numbers is atemporal, so that the procedure of adding numbers and the resulting sum do not affect the numbers involved in the operation. The realm of human action is quite different. It is temporal and continuous, so that there cannot be mere repetition of human action and events. Every human action internally modifies the previous action in the context of which it takes place. This is to say, a mere aggregate of human actions is inconceivable. They always have an internal organization, to understand the nature of which is the central problem of social science. In fact, on close examination, the mathematical analogy itself will be seen to be fallacious. Following Hegel, Marxians point out that the series of natural numbers is formed by the addition of units so that each number has the same relation to its neighbors that any other number has. But nevertheless, the series also generates, at various points along itself, different new relations. For instance, the number 4 is not only the one that follows 3, but also the square of 2. Now, this argument for the law is most inept. That 4 is the square of 2 is not a quality or a new relation that arises at some point in the series. It can be discovered from the very beginning of the series. 1 is the square root of 1. 2 is the square root of 4. 3 is the square root of 9, and so on. It is fallacious to suppose, as is done implicitly by those who use this illustration, that the operation of addition has anything to do with this new relation among numbers. It has nothing to do with it. This relation is discovered by a quite different mathematical operation symbolized by the square root. Other relations among numbers can be found upon other operators. The point is that relations among numbers do not arise with the generation of the series, but with the introduction of operators, and hence it is meaningless to say about a cardinal number that, quote, it is not only next in the series after, end quote, so long as our operator is only that symbolized by plus. In fact, the usual concept of quantity fails to apply even to those human actions and experiences which are necessarily evaluated in terms of degree. This, I think, is proved by the following argument of Wittgenstein's, in which he shows that statements of degree of a quality cannot be analyzed into the logical product of singular statements of quantity and a completing supplementary statement to the effect that those were all the quantities of which that particular quality was made up. He says, quote, "Let us call the unit of, say, brightness B, and let EB be the statement that the entity E possesses this brightness, then the presupposition E to B, which says that E has 2 degrees of brightness, should be analyzable into the logical product EB and EB. But this is equal to EB. If, on the other hand, we try to distinguish between the units and consequently write E to B equals EB and EB, we assume the 2 different units of brightness, and then if an entity possesses 1 unit, the question could arise, which of the 2 B and B or B it is, which is obviously absurd," end quote. Now, if my listeners can follow that, I'm very impressed, because I could not, but perhaps that's why I've never read Wittgenstein. Continuing. If this argument is valid, and I think it is, then it refutes the law of transformation of quantity into quality, for it shows in a rigorous manner that each degree of quality is itself an impartite quality. Or better, every quality is a specific structure of which the elements are themselves qualities. Hence it is that the relation between red and redder cannot be a quantitative one. Quote, "The relation of difference of degree is an internal relation," end quote, as Wittgenstein himself puts it. It shows that in the context of human actions and experiences, quantity and quality are neither reducible one to the other, nor intertranslatable. In behalf of Marx, it may be pointed out that by means of this law, one seeks neither to eliminate quality nor to reduce it to quantity. The law explains the emergence of qualities. But if our argument above is correct, such a law cannot explain the emergence of qualities, for the argument shows that the so-called variation of quantity is already a qualitative change. It is at this point that the ideas of modal points and of leap become necessary. If, however, the idea of quantitative change does not have meaning in the human context, these ideas too cannot serve any purpose. But even if this objection is waived, certain difficulties still remain. The concept of leap makes the preceding changes superfluous. At any rate, the relation between the preparatory stages, the maturing contradictions, and the bursting of bonds, the revolution, is like the relation between good deeds and grace, extremely difficult for the uninitiated to grasp. Apart from this, it has been pointed out by several critics that insofar as the idea of leap is real, it entails discontinuity, and hence it would be impossible to make generalizations about the pattern of human history as a whole. Here, we should perhaps view this problem in the light of another law, the law of the negation of the negation. This law, if valid, may provide some ground for predicting the general developmental pattern of history in spite of the law about leaps. For while leaps describe one aspect of the mode of historical movement, the law of the negation may describe another aspect of this mode. However, the law does not appear to be valid. In the first place, the formulation of this law involves the general problem of self-reference, and hence, if admitted without elaborate safeguards, it would give rise to paradoxes. Personally, I incline to the minority view on this question, represented by Jürgensen and David H. Parker, who advocate partial or total elimination of the concept of self-reference. Since, however, some of the difficulties arising from this rejection appear to be insuperable, I shall not argue from this point of view. It stands to reason, however, that the negation of a negation gives us back only the original proposition. to say, as this law implies, that the denial of denial yields a proposition that is on a higher level than the original proposition and hence different from it, is to violate the logical law of double negation. It is true, of course, that the law of double negation belongs to Aristotelian logic, to which Marxian dialectics is by no means subservient. But before we allow ourselves to believe that the Marxian dialectical law supersedes the law of double negation, we should closely examine the concept of negation used in this law. It will be seen that it has to be constructed in one of the following two ways. One, the double or treble or nth negation signifies simply the repetition of a given operation. Or two, the repeated negation represents the self-movement of the proposition. Now, if the first meaning is adopted, we already assume the law of transformation of quantity into quality, which has been shown to be untenable, and if the law is interpreted in terms of self-movement, the latter will imply either circularity or a transcendental teleology, neither of which is admissible in the Marxian system. To be able, therefore, to explain how vertical order and forward movement arise from self-movement, the Marxist has to introduce a new idea, namely, that the next phase of the movement contains the previous phase and is thus higher than it. The notion that one phase may contain another is by no means easy to understand, particularly in a dynamic context which requires it to be interpreted in the temporal order. I am not sure what it would mean in temporal terms. It may be interpreted in terms of sociocultural heritage or in terms of the idea of preparation, so that the final or specific stage of history contains all the antecedent stages in the sense that they have been preparations for the final stage. This interpretation is not quite compatible with Marxism, since this too requires one to accept a transcendental teleology. If the alternative interpretation in terms of cultural heritage is chosen, there is no need for the law of negation of the negation. The greatest difficulty, however, is about the application of this law, from which perhaps all the above difficulties arise. Marx and Engels emphasize that the laws of dialectics are primarily laws of reality and only derivatively of thought. The laws of thought are merely reflections of objective relations. This obscures an important asymmetry between objective relations and the propositional relations. The negation of every proposition is itself a proposition, but with this important difference, that whereas the positive proposition can stand for a fact, the negative proposition stands for none, unless we hold that there are negative facts. But even then, the dissimilarity between positive and negative facts would remain. Now, in the circumstances, the possibility of meaningfully negating a proposition depends upon the fact that a proposition is not about itself. It may be about another proposition, so that repeated negation operations upon a proposition produce an increasing number of propositions, but no new fact other than that which the original positive proposition was about. Now, it seems important to note that, unlike propositions, reality is self-dependent. It is, as it were, its own truth. The concept of negation in the realm of reality, as distinguished from the realm of discourse, can therefore mean only non-existence. Since the law of negation is a law of reality, it becomes the law of the non-existence of the non-existent. But the non-existence of the non-existent is at best only a tautology. In any case, it cannot signify a modality or power of existence as required by the law under discussion. The Marxist may feel, however, that all these objections are useless, for they have already been anticipated and disposed of by Engels. In Anti-Düring, he says, quote, and this is a lengthy quote, "Negation in dialectics does not mean simply saying no, or declaring that something does not exist, or destroying it in any way one likes. Long ago, Spinoza said, omnis determinatio est negatio. Every limitation or determination is at the same time a negation. and further, the kind of negation here determined in the first place by the general and secondly by the particular nature of the process. I must not only negate, but also in turn sublate the negation. I must therefore so construct the first negation that the second remains or becomes impossible. In what way? This depends on the particular nature of each individual case. If I grind a grain of barley or crush an insect, it is true I have carried out the first part of the action, but I have made the second part impossible. Each class of things, therefore, has its appropriate form of being negated in such a way that it gives rise to a development, and it is just the same with each class of concepts and ideas. End quote. This forthright clarification of the meaning of the law makes short work of our objections. In fact, it leaves no room for objections. But then it has also become clear that it is not a law of any kind. It is an arbitrary assumption, a rule of the Marxian language for talking about change. If in advance of all argument and evidence one ordains that change is always an assent, criticism is obviously out of place. I shall close this section with two general remarks. In their exposition of the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society and thought, Marx and Engels are content to offer only illustrations of the law, illustrations which are of course drawn from the most diverse fields. One finds hardly any systematic evidence or logical demonstration. Now, the method of illustration has its point. Where one uses it as the only method, however, one does so with a clear end in view, namely, to show that in that field generalizations and laws are neither possible nor desirable. Plainly, illustrations alone cannot establish any law or generalization. The second general remark is this: the idea of hierarchy, system, covariation, and dialectic, meaning syntax, evaluation of variables, and formalization, are distinct notions, and nothing but confusion and pseudo-problems arise if they are not distinguished. Positively, it is of great importance to determine the proper relation in which they stand to each other. For though distinct, they are yet most intimately related. While a system depends upon hierarchy, the idea of hierarchy is independent of system. This way of expressing the idea may not be quite correct. It may be better expressed by saying that the ideas of order and sacredness are distinct, and yet an order is not intelligible without the idea of atemporality, which is an essential element in the idea of sacredness. In the same way, covariation is not essential to the concept of system unless a system is viewed sub specie temporis. Most important is the thought that though dialectic works in a system, the principle of dialectic is a system-transcending principle, and hence, strictly speaking, there can be no dialectical systems. The logic of systems is not dialectical. In the philosophical and sociological thought of Marx, these distinctions and conceptual relations are either ignored or obscured. In the course of this section, an effort has been made to uncover the resulting confusions and to show how part of the plausibility of Marxism depends upon them. This long and rather involved discussion, however, was occasioned by the necessity of finding a consistent interpretation of the concept of mode of production and of that of changes therein. To this we now return. Section 3. Having seen in the course of the last section in what sense the concept of mode of production may mean the entire socio-economic system and may yet be defined as the way production relations and technology are related, the next important question is, how and why do changes in technology take place? We cannot say that the technological order is autonomous, for then man has to accept a pitiable position against which we have to reckon the whole weight of Marx's thought. For the Marxian theory of social change, this is the crucial question. With it are intertwined several other important questions, namely the questions of the place of science and the role of ideas in social development, of the limits of technological advance, the problem of evolution, and the general issue of determinism, viz. Freedom. I do not think Marx thought clearly about these problems. First, I will consider human needs as the determinant of changes in the technological order. Passages in the writings of Marx can be found to support the idea that the ever-expanding needs system of man gives rise to the necessity of expanding his technology. The expansion of human needs may be taken as a law of man's development. General support for this theory can be found in Marx's thesis that it is man's material necessities that are at the root of his productive effort, which, in its turn, is the base of all other forms of his life. Natural as this explanation seems, there is nevertheless a fundamental difficulty in accepting it. In making needs, and therefore consumption, the fundamental motive force of man's economic and social life, one admits another determinant of human society, which, from a logical point of view, will not be an aspect of the self-evolution of matter, for, insofar as the need system determines production, some cosmic analogue of it would determine the self-evolution of matter. If consumption is regarded as the regulator of production changes, there can be no logical objection to cutting down consumption to any degree considered desirable as an alternative to changing the social structure to meet the increasing needs of man. If technological advance is not regarded as autotelic and automatic, the conflict of productive forces and production relations can be avoided by arresting the development of productive forces beyond a certain point of suitable modification in the need system. Such an alternative, if it were permitted within the Marxist system, would constitute a serious contradiction. Marx does not countenance the idea of arresting the advance of production and technology. There is another aspect of this difficulty. The labor theory of value is fundamental to Marx's system. It has been suggested that Marx lacked the ability to deal with this problem from the subjective marginalist point of view. I think that Marx's exclusion of the subjective point of view in the theory of value was deliberate. The reason for this should be clear from the previous paragraph. The adoption of the subjectivist approach would have compromised the primacy of labor, which, on the human plane, corresponds to the self-dynamism of matter, and about whose preponderating role in the development of man's life Engels has written in clear and emphatic terms. It seems to me that Marx was aware of these problems and tried to solve them in his unfinished notes in A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Not being a finished product, they are at places impenetrably obscure. He sometimes establishes the identity of production and consumption, at others shows their complementarity and establishes a reciprocal relation between them. Though he seems to be opposed to the view that consumption is the end of production, he characterizes it as the most shallow conception, his own view does not clearly emerge. The following passage from pages 278 to 279 provides perhaps the clearest expression of Marx's position. Quote, "Consumption produces production by creating the necessity for new production, i.e. by providing the ideal inward impelling cause which constitutes the prerequisite of production. Consumption furnishes the impulse for production as well as its object, which plays in production the part of its guiding aim. It is clear that while production furnishes the material object of consumption, consumption provides the ideal object of production as its image, its want, its impulse, and its purpose. It furnishes the object of production in its subjective form. No wants, no production, but consumption reproduces the want." End quote. For the non-converted, however, the passage is not easy to understand. It seems that Marx is explaining here the relation between production and consumption, labor need, in dialectical terms. This involves the idea of internal necessity. The difficulties to which such a concept gives rise in the Marxian dialectics have been indicated and will be indicated further as we proceed. However, insofar as consumption is the subjective counterpart, idea, image, of production, the ultimacy of the latter remains intact, for it is fundamental to Marxism that the subjective form is but the reflection of the objective material reality. This primacy of production, implicit in the general philosophical position of Marxism, gives rise to difficulties in the theory of capitalist crisis also. One readily recalls in this connection the extreme and unorthodox form Tugen-Baranowski gave to what has been called the disproportionate theory of crises. By adhering consistently to the thesis of the ultimacy of production, we'll find it very difficult to prove the unorthodoxy of Tugen, and the absurdity of his final conclusion would throw doubt on the validity of the ultimacy of production, which is one of the premises in Tugen's deductions. Before discussing ways of resolving these difficulties, I will discuss the role of science. The determination of technological advance by scientific Let's try that again. The determination of technological advance by scientific advance seems obvious, so much so that technology may be regarded as simply applied science. It may seem that this should present no difficulty for the Marxian system once it is remembered that mind is a stage in the self-development of matter. But this does not obviate all difficulties. It is essential for the materialist position that mind, whatever its origin, should not at any stage be regarded as completely independent and master of matter. Here we come upon one more aspect of fundamental inconsistency in Marx. As we said just now, the doctrine of the ultimate supremacy of mind cannot be maintained since it goes against both materialism and the principle of dialectic. But there is scarcely a way out for the Marxian. The alternative doctrine of the ultimate supremacy of matter is no less undialectical and gives rise to difficulties when applied to certain problems. Marx says that men's social existence determines their consciousness. Summary 4. Now, in this context, this would mean that advances in pure science cannot take place prior to the developments in technology. Such a view is, of course, preposterous. A better application of the thesis of materialism, however, is suggested by Marx himself in the Critique, Summary 12. According to these hints, we may say that the problems which science selects for tackling are posed by the socio-economic situation. So far, the advance of science is determined, but the solutions are not determined and are the contribution of science. At this point, we can see that on a different level, it is the same problem which we came up against when we examined the role of human needs in inducing technological advance. There, in my opinion, the authentic Marxian position was to hold that needs were an internal necessity of production. The problems of science would represent the same internal necessity on another level. The difficulties at this stage are these. The notion of internal necessity, the phrase is not Marx's, is something more than a form of dialectical conflict. It implies a close process evolving towards its completion, after which it will cease. This is implied by some other statements by Marx. How far it is compatible with other principles of Marx will appear in the course of what follows. In the second place, science ceases to be a determinant of technological change. This is as it should be, but it leaves the development of productive forces master of the situation. That is, it makes the history of technology autonomous and autotelic. It may be emphasized at this point that here our problem does not consist in discovering the determinants of change or of technological change in particular. In the Marxian system, such problems would be meaningless. Our problem is to discover the determinants of the direction of change. I think the answer to our difficulties is found in a passage of Capital, page 177, where Marx speaks of the necessary opposition between nature and man, the latter being one of nature's own forms. The continuous modification of nature is inherent in the self-evolution of matter, which is a process that is inherently dialectical. Continuous development of technology is the result of this dialectics. If we then accept that at one stage in its self-development, matter creates a force which is its own grand opposite, the difficulty of finding the determinant of the direction of change is consistent with the monism of the system is resolved. It is the inherent dynamism of man which must advance technology. Material needs and scientific curiosity are only aspects of this dynamism, work-labor, and since this dynamism is only a dialectical aspect of nature, the question of an exogenous factor does not arise. Also, because it is man who creates technology in conformity with his own nature, the objection that the technological order cannot be autonomous is satisfactorily met. It is true that changes in technology are prior, but this does not involve us in a technological theory of history, because these changes are not self-determined, but an aspect of man's work and creativity. That is science, which, as we have just seen, is an aspect of matter's own self-development, and hence is not an independent and non-material factor. From the Marxian point of view, therefore, it is not a question of changes in nature determining changes in the human order. Both are aspects of a single process of development and are commonly determined by a single set of general laws. This is the meaning of passages 11 and 12 in the summary. At this point, it becomes extremely difficult to see the difference between the Marxian formulation and certain avowedly metaphysical and non-materialistic formulations. The way in which man comes to be opposed to nature is simply an aspect of the problem of one and many, or of the problem of the primordial division of the one into two. That is to say, once the ultimate reality of the many is rejected, it is irrelevant how the nature of the one is conceived. In many versions of the tradition, all questions about the nature of the one are rejected as senseless. There is one other implication of this dialectical solution. A consistent dialectic implies its own negation, namely monism, and this implies that a theory of development must be cyclical. This should not be difficult to see. There are the following possibilities. 1. The process of development goes on infinitely. In this case, it must contain the possibility of its own inversion, and hence in time it will appear as cyclic. 2. The process is finite. In this case, it reaches its completion only when the opposition is resolved. That is to say, when the original unity is restored. The difference between 1 and 2 is purely logical, not empirical. In the first case, we cannot describe the process as circular. All that we can say is that circularity must be one of its phases. At the same time, we cannot describe it in any other way, for the course and teleology of an infinite process are unintelligible. 3. That the development has a definite goal, that is to say, matter is developing to become something else, X. In this case, the development is not dialectical but teleological, since X must enter the process as an external determinant. In this list of possible positions, the third possibility may be taken to represent the Marxian standpoint. The Marxist may, however, regard it as improperly formulated. It may be pointed out that it is unnecessary to suppose that X changes into Y, and hence it may be denied that there is any necessity to postulate a substratum for the changes, a mysterious X to which different changes, conceived atomistically, belong. Change itself is the reality. The correct formulation there would be, there is constant change, it has a direction, and there are general laws of change. But that is all. The cyclic view is not necessary, for there is no reason why these general laws should necessarily be those of cyclic change. The objection lacks force and cogency. Insofar as the above formulation is not obscurantist, it should culminate in an absolutely negative point of view, which, however, is thoroughly alien to Marxism. even apart from this, there is another important difficulty. These laws of change are understood by men. Insofar as the human mind is regarded as a phase in the self-understanding of this changing reality, we are thrown back on one of the two possibilities mentioned above, both of which imply a cyclic view of history repudiated by Marx, and if mind is given an independent and higher status, a non-material and non-dialectical system would have to be accepted. Two connected questions now arise. 1. Man opposes himself to nature as one of her own forces, says Marx. Does this opposition last forever? If not, how is it resolved? The other question is, 2. How are the general laws known and validated? The first question, in a more concrete form, has constituted one of the stock objections against Marxism. The conflict between classes is, according to Marx, the motive force of social change or development. What, it has been asked, will be the motive force for societal development after the establishment of the communist society? Will development and history come to a stop, or will conflict take another form? Or will these laws of development cease to operate in the perfect communist society? This is a well-known objection against the Marxian theory of social development. That, however, is not to say that it has been satisfactorily disposed of. It is well known that Marx did not write systematically on these problems. Different lines of solution have therefore been adopted. There are, of course, texts to support each one of these. I will consider 3 alternatives. Before doing so, I may point out that nobody, to my knowledge, thinks that history will come to a stop at the dawn of the classless society. In fact, Marx's own view is that human history, in the real sense of the term, would only begin then. Summary 14. There are, firstly, those who think that the law of dialectical development will, of course, apply to the communistic society also, but the conflicts will arise on a different plane, and their resolution will be much more smooth. In other words, history would then be a regular unfolding of the higher and still higher possibilities of man. Support for this view is found in those statements of Marx and Engels where they speak of a radical change in human nature under a different society. This interpretation, however, runs into at least one serious difficulty, which I will formulate from 2 points of view. Is the plane on which conflict now occurs material or not? If the answer is that it is no longer material, dialectical materialism has been given up. And if it is material, then the proof for it will involve reductionism insofar as, ex hypothesi, it cannot be maintained that the conflict arises directly on the plane of production. Now let us look at it from the other side. What happens to the development of technology and the productive forces at the disposal of society? If they continue to develop, but now do not come into conflict with production relations, this can only mean either that 1. Production relations now change in accordance with the development of productive forces, or that 2. Production relations are now such as to be always in harmony with any development in technology and the productive forces. The second alternative must be ruled out if our explications of the concepts mode of production and productive forces are correct. Alternative 1 will in effect mean that conflict will no longer be the basis of social development, and this is against the main alternative which we are considering. In any case, if we adopt it, we cannot say that the conflict is material. Besides, the question is then what these changes in social organization are. Obviously, they must belong to some trans-social realm. These difficulties have their source, I think, in the ambivalent, not to say superficial, attitude of Marx towards technological advance. He did not generalize his doctrine that every force is progressive till a certain point, after which it becomes reactionary. Had he done so, he would have seen that continuous technological advance cannot be compatible with human welfare. He has seen the evils of technology under capitalism, but he has ascribed them to capitalism, not to technology, thus, perhaps without realizing, taking an absolute position in regard to the advantages of technological advance. Marx, it can easily be seen, adopts what may be called a structural, functional approach towards the evils or dysfunctions of capitalism. On such a view, it is not possible to maintain an absolutely dynamic standpoint, as Marx seems to do with regard to technology. One has to abandon it and adopt a static standpoint at a certain stage, or else take a cyclic view of development. Of course, in one sense, the cyclic and the static standpoints are the same. It is clear, however, that Marx was determined to avoid both. This may be explained perhaps in terms of his practical objectives. I cannot, however, explain why Marx fails to see that with the achievement of communist social organization, the society wields its power as a whole, and to allow unrestricted development of technology in such a society is to acquiesce in the illogic of part developing against whole. This point will perhaps be better understood if I put it in terms of the more general question which was formulated at the beginning. Once nature has created its own alter in the form of man who sets himself over against nature, how will this conflict be resolved? Again, there are 2 or 3 possibilities. 1, either man or nature wins, or 2, a higher form evolves. If the first alternative is adopted, dialectic is abrogated, for one of its terms is abolished. We may therefore consider the second alternative, which seems to be consonant with the principle of dialectical development. Materialism becomes a question of preferential naming at this level. The difficulty with this alternative is that it carries us beyond the human social level. I may point out that Toynbee faces a similar problem in his philosophy of history. One may like to ask about the nature of the post-communist higher form. An answer in intelligible language does not seem possible. It can easily be seen that it is not a question of imagining something on the lines of Huxley's Brave New World or devising a scientific secular version of paradise. Toynbee's Communion of Saints suffers from the same implicit psychologism. In view of these difficulties, another approach may seem more promising. In the 11th thesis of Feuerbach, Marx says, quote, "Philosophers so far have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." End quote. If one takes one's cue from this thesis, the proper attitude towards the objection we are considering would be to rule out as superfluous all questions about the far-off future and ultimate things. This is an attitude which, it is well known, was adopted by the Buddha. But then Buddhism does not recoil from its logical implications. The teaching of Marx disallows the adoption of anything like the Buddhist position of a universal void. From this point of view, the questions which we have raised are superfluous because they are not concerned with the business of making history. If we know that our present system requires change, then the know-how of change is what matters most. Of course, we must know what type of change we want, and our knowledge of what we want must be distinguished from mere wishful thinking and utopia-mongering. The discovery of the general laws of historical development does this. It distinguishes scientific from utopian socialism. A scientific study of history shows us how systems have changed and how ours is going to change in the future. What may or may not happen in the far-off future is an inquiry for those who may be interested in contemplating the world for its own sake. Do we want to bring about better conditions than the present ones? If we do, does dialectical materialism help us in understanding our present situation and thereby in the task of changing it for the better? If it does, then that is all that is required of theory. This attitude involves, no doubt, a subtle kind of argumentum ad hominem. But this point I will not press, for in my opinion no intellectual position can finally avoid some form of this argument. This is by no means an unimportant point, but I cannot go into it here without starting out on an altogether different line. My first difficulty with this approach is this. The distinction between scientific and utopian socialism is based on the claim that the changes desired are inherent in the nature of things, and hence to desire and to try to bring about any other pattern of change is folly. To accept this, however, is to reject the pragmatic point of view put forward a few lines back. A consistent pragmatism cannot finally avoid some form of pluralism and relativism, and hence must allow for a principle of tolerance leading, if one does not leave off, to the mysteries of negative metaphysics. But even if we don't go so far as that, it is immediately important to realize that to adopt the active purposive point of view against the interpretive contemplative standpoint is ultimately to adopt a subjective collective point of view against the scientific ontological one. It is, of course, true that the points of view are not necessarily incompatible, the condition for their compatibility being a hierarchical relation between the two in which the former is subordinate to the latter. This indeed might seem to be the way out suggested by Marx from the difficulties of the pragmatic outlook, which is an integral part of his system. This solution, however, destroys the force of Marxian praxeology, for then the attempt to achieve the knowledge of the total pattern of change cannot be dismissed as idle speculation. Apart from this, if we accept this approach, we will have to admit that the laws of dialectical development have only limited validity. They may be valid, but we cannot say anything at all definite about the future. For all we know, they might not be. It may be urged that, on the basis of Marx's study of history, the pattern of the next major change appears clear. In acting according to this plan, we are acting scientifically. The fact that as yet we do not know more should not indefinitely block our way to action on the basis of what we know. Now, this is based on the assumption that what we do know is indisputably valid, but in the nature of the case, our interpretation depends for its validity on its ability to answer satisfactorily the questions that have been raised above. The decisive objection to this operational approach comes from Marx himself, who holds that a new era will open with the completion of the communist revolution. According to him, all this has been prehistory. With the abolition of capitalism, history will begin. Then man will be conscious master of his fate and the supreme maker of his own history. In other words, in the struggle of man and nature, man will be victorious and the struggle will be abolished. Necessity will end. Freedom will begin. I will not try to determine how far this is utopianism in the worst sense of the word. I may point out, however, that utopia-mongering seems to be a sufficiently powerful motive for bridging the gulf between Marx and Toynbee, whose communion of saints, or church as a higher species of society, agrees with Marx's vision of the future in important respects, except for the inclusion of God. Leaving that aside, two questions may be raised. First, if the goal of world history is this final victory over nature, this abolition of necessity, then does not our approach cease to be dialectical? How can it be distinguished from a teleological view of history? Second, should we think that the reign of freedom is the end of history? If the answer is no, one would naturally like to know the pattern and direction of history after the reign of freedom has begun. According to Marx, the dualism of man and nature, with its underlying identity in nature, has been the basis of history's or prehistory's movement until now. However, if we examined the predicted reign of freedom, we would find that the identity in nature remains, but the dualism stands necessarily abrogated. It may be held that a new and higher dualism within man would develop, and that is how history proper will continue to proceed to higher and higher planes. In that case, there are the following two possibilities. One, if we retain the identity in nature, one of the terms of this new and higher dualism must be nature at a level higher than man the master, and the next victory must belong to it. From a logical point of view, the process must turn backwards at a certain point and start again. 2. If the assumption of natural identity is dropped, the new dualism will be absolutely coordinate, and history will proceed in terms that must at present be unintelligible to man. One may, however, think in terms of development, which is a simple procession along a smooth course and does not involve antithesis and conflicts. That is to say, one may say that after the reign of human freedom has begun, social development should be viewed in terms of social maintenance and not at all in terms of social change. It seems to me that this theory, however inconsonant with Marxism it may appear at first sight, would on a closer view prove to be the closest approximation to Marx's undeveloped views on this question. It is, however, untenable. The process of self-maintenance, insofar as it takes place in time, must involve dualism and ultimately conflict. Dualism and conflict cannot be finally eliminated unless time is abolished. So long as things do not take place simultaneously, what does happen implies certain possibilities which have thereby been excluded. Where alternatives exist, they may sometimes become actual, and there cannot be any self-effective guarantee against their coming into clash. The first possibility seems to have been admitted by Engels in his preface to Dialectics of Nature. It looks like an explicit acceptance of a cyclic theory of human history. Whether or not it is actually so, I cannot say, but a cyclic view of history would be a fundamental departure from Marx's thought. I may now briefly consider the implication of the idea of conscious mastery of history and nature by man, leaving aside the objections that have been raised against it just now. In the first place, it is to be noted that the self-evolution of matter now assumes as its highest form the self-direction of humanity, an idea derived from Feuerbach and Comte. With the introduction of this idea in the thought of Marx, there arises a well-known philosophical problem which could not otherwise be raised within his dialectical system. If the self-knowing free man, master of nature, is really a possibility of nature, what divides him from his lower incarnation, the ignorant man? In other words, when freedom is defined as the recognition of necessity, one accepts two states: 1, ignorance of necessity, and 2, knowledge of necessity. Since the fundamental identity of the two is maintained, it is of course pointless to say that it is, after all, necessity. We might as well say that man is always free. Sometimes he is ignorant, then he is bound when he knows he is free. The question that now arises is, what makes him ignorant? The Marxian answer may be, it is the law of the development of nature. But this does not really dispose of the question, for we can still legitimately ask, if that be so, why does matter always know it? Or rather, why does not matter always know it? Let me, however, put this point from another angle. When the man who is master of himself and of nature emerges, something radically new and higher has come into being. This knowing being is fundamentally other than matter, for if it were really a form of nature, there would be logically no fundamental difference between the evolving matter, which is not conscious of the laws according to which it develops, and man who understands matter, and finally man who understands the laws of development of both nature and society, and thereby directs the whole process himself to his own end, or, which is the same, for ends which he knows he cannot be otherwise. If a difference between these stages is maintained, I do not see how one could escape the further implication that there is a superior force, knowledge, to which is opposed another, ignorance, and this would give rise to the age-old problem of explaining the necessity of this opposition. Now, this necessity, so far as I can see, cannot be explained without going beyond the sphere of intelligible reason, and if that be so, it is unwarranted to believe in the possibility of full self-knowledge on the part of man. Alternatively, if it is held that there is no ultimate difference between these various stages, we are back again to a cyclic theory of history. It may be argued that the problem of discovering the reason for the necessary gap between ignorance of necessity, or forgetfulness, shades of Plato, and recognition of necessity does not arise from one who starts with change as the ultimate reality. Against this, I have at the very beginning presented an argument that seems to me fundamental and conclusive, namely the argument that a sheerly dynamic view of reality would lead to some form of Zen, which the Marxist cannot countenance. In the present methodological context, my difficulty may be formulated as follows. Does not a purely dynamic concept of reality mean that knowledge of the laws of change can never be complete and objectively valid, for if it were, time and change would thereby be abolished? These difficulties may be formulated from the epistemological standpoint. Are the laws immanent? If they are, what prevents their understanding? If the possibility of self-understanding is the possibility of self-understanding immanent in the self-knower? If so, what prevents the maturation of this possibility? Is the knower involved in the process, or is he outside it? If involved in the process, how is he related to the factors preventing his self-knowledge? If outside it, what connects him to the process? That is, in order to see the inevitability of its developmental pattern, he must go outside the process and view it as a whole. Does Marx allow this possibility? These considerations make it unusually difficult for the ordinary student to understand the precise status of the laws of development in the Marxian system. The laws, it is claimed, are necessary. This means that in the logical order they are absolute and immutable, or they are conventions of some sort. This is one absolute. Alternatively, the laws could be replaced by another set. The fact of change is another absolute. According to Engels, matter is a third, for he clearly thinks of it as that which changes, remaining eternally the same in all its transformations. Apart from these three immutables in a monistic system, there is one other difficulty. The knowing mind must also be immutable and eternal, and then will it not be at one with the known? Does Marxian epistemology accept this position, or the analysis of necessary truth given by the modern linguistic philosophy? A word about the logical nature of the necessary laws of development may be in order at this point. They could be deductive, inductive, abductive, or dialectical. If they are dialectically derived, I have been showing that Marx does not embrace the full implications of the dialectical method. In the strict sense of the term, they could not perhaps be inductive, but if they are, or better, if they are abductive, they lose, in the first place, their necessary character. In the second place, there are all the difficulties which I have discussed, which, while examining the views of those who think that we need not think about the future development of society beyond the inauguration of the communist society. If they are deductive, they would not, on Marx's own showing, explain the logic of change and development. Apart from this, they would presuppose axioms or postulates from which they are deductions. According to Marx, men make their own history, but not as they like. A brief examination of this oft-quoted dictum may throw light on the problems I have been posing. In the first place, in this passage, Marx says something which I think is obvious, namely that the present is determined. This determination needs not be complete by the past. That men make their own history may, therefore, mean that though the work of previous generations of men is one of the fundamental and invariant determinants of human history, within the limits fixed by past history, men in any given generation can direct their history according to their own collective purposes. Since past history was also made by man, we can say that man himself is the maker of his own history. I should like to pause here to make one comment. The implicit definition of freedom in this context is in terms of self-determination. This definition is not identical with that in terms of recognition of necessity, though with additional postulates the two can coincide. One should therefore note that the dictum, men make their own history, is true not with reference to any given generation of men, but with reference to the continuity of the general historical process. But is it true for the whole process? That is doubtful. Man arises at a later stage in natural evolution. Until the emergence of man, the whole process is unconscious, though it may be gnomic. The development of human history is, therefore, conditioned not only by previous conscious human history, but by unconscious natural history or evolution as well. In behalf of Marxism, it may be urged once again that the unconscious natural history is a phase of the one grand process of dialectical development. To this, however, it would be sufficient to repeat our question. How does man, without going out of the process, identify himself and history with the unconscious self-evolution of nature? How does he proceed further to identify the self-evolution of nature with nature's conquest by himself? How does he know that the process of self-development of nature and its conquest by man are ultimately merely different forms of self-regulation and self-development? The problem of the consciousness of the whole is the crucial problem of Marxism. In fact, of any universal philosophy of history. The whole Marxian system, particularly the theory of change, depends upon it, for it is based not on its remote possibility, but on its realization here and now. The consciousness of the whole is, according to Marx, born by the proletariat, and that is why it alone can bring about the revolution which will inaugurate the next, or the last, intelligible stage of development. For those who want to accept Marxism on the intellectual grounds that this proves to be even a greater offense than was Christianity to non-Christians. For it is not easy to understand how the proletariat, an integral part of the social structure, can be the bearer of the consciousness of the whole and can at the right time abolish itself as the ruling proletariat. The answer given in behalf of the Marxian theory is even more puzzling. The proletariat realizes this possibility by virtue of its position in the social system. From a logical point of view, any class occupying a particular position cannot have a knowledge of the whole structure, for if it did, it would imply that the class had no position in the system, and that it is ex hypothesi false. I think the force of this answer, whatever it be, derives from a tacit confusion of the logical and the psychological standpoints. The psychologistic fallacy involved in this argument for the prophetic and revolutionary mission of the proletariat cannot be eliminated by holding that the proletariat acts simply as an instrument of the inexorable laws of social development, for that would imply a form of anthropomorphism or crude theology. It is, perhaps, to avoid this that Marx sometimes calls these laws immanent. Since, however, the logical status of these laws is left wholly unclarified in the Marxian system, it is useless for the non-Marxist to attempt to understand this or any other Marxian theses in terms of the laws of social development. Psychologism is particularly regrettable in Marx, for he was one of those few thinkers who insisted on the independence of the socio-economic system and opposed any attempt to interpret social phenomena in terms of invariant properties of human nature and specific motivations of individuals. It is, however, important to add that the contemporary sociological theories, including those of formal, phenomenological, and behavioristic schools, Simmel, Vierkant, von Weiss, etc., are seldom free from psychologism. It is true that the possibility of the knowledge of the whole is allowed in almost all traditions. How far that is justified I do not wish to discuss here, for that would take us too far afield. But I must pause to make two remarks on this point. The first is that in all traditions, with the possible exception of certain modern variants, this possibility is always allowed on the individual plane only, never on the collective plane. The second is that the realization of this possibility is thought in absolutely negative terms and is frankly regarded as a mystery. The present analysis would show that in the Marxian system, both these consequences are implicitly admitted but formally repudiated, with the result that the crucial problem of the knowledge of the whole is bypassed. Except for two comments, I do not wish to discuss systematically the well-worn question of freedom, viz. Determinism, in the Marxian theory of social change, for I have already made comments which I think have an important bearing on this problem. In my opinion, the concept of freedom belongs to the family of concepts of which the most important member is the concept of responsibility. The elucidation of this, however, involves the theory of language and hence cannot be pursued here. In Marxian discussions of the issue between freedom and determinism, the concept of responsibility does in fact play an important role, but it is not dialectically analyzed and hence is employed on a psychologistic plane only. If, however, the concept of responsibility had been related to an adequate theory of language, to which a serious analysis of the concept would have led, the whole question of human freedom would have assumed a radically different aspect. The second remark I want to make is this. I think Plekhanov is representing the correct Marxian position when he says that necessity and freedom are one and the same thing viewed under two different forms, the objective and the subjective. It seems to me that a knowledge of this identity is at least part of the meaning of freedom on this view. But does not this knowledge imply the abrogation of the subject-object dualism and thereby of the world historical process? All these inconsistencies are epitomized, so to say, in the ideal of a self-directing humanity accepted by Marx and Engels. In the positive and secular form in which it has been accepted by Marx, it seems to be a self-contradictory ideal. On the plane of action, self-contradiction corresponds to suicide. Does this mean that in the violent conflict between the Marxist and the so-called Christian world, the former is doomed to defeat? I do not think so, for the Christian countries have forgotten their Christian heritage and have accepted the fundamental contradiction of Marxism, the ideal of a self-directing humanity, while the Marxist world fights for an ideal which is perverse from the traditional point of view. The inheritors of ancient traditions, both Oriental and Occidental, have no alternative idea to fight for, and hence, in a sense, they are fighting for no idea. It is idle to expect that they can win against Marxism, unless one can hope for metanoia. Now, with that, we finish this momentous essay. I'll dispense with reading the footnotes. I do want to offer one comment, however. I think many of the listeners may be tempted to be dismissive of this final comment in light of the events of 1989, 1990, 91, 92, the collapse of the Marxist world. I think Professor Saran's views on this can be rescued if we make reference to Augusto Del Noce's idea that Marxism and liberalism have sort of mutually assimilated each other, and so not Marxism in a strictly ideological sense. I don't want to enter into that perspective. I think that's quite silly, but sort of the spirit of Marxism, and that's what Saran is referring to here, is what Marxism represents metaphysically has been adopted by Western liberalism, the world that Saran here refers to as the Christian world. And with that, I conclude. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description. If you do subscribe, please remember to hit that little bell icon, because otherwise YouTube won't inform you when I upload new videos. If you'd prefer to read my essays over the video format, they are all available in written form on Substack, link also in the description.